There's a specific kind of silence that a narcissist has never had to survive before you gave it to them. Not the silent treatment they've handed out 100 times as punishment, engineered and controlled, always with an expiration date they set themselves. Not the cold withdrawal that follows a fight, guaranteed to lift the moment they decide it's served its purpose. This is a different silence entirely, indefinite, unauthored by them, arriving without a script they get to write the ending to. And the psychology of what happens inside a narcissist's mind when this specific silence never breaks is one of the most revealing, least understood processes in the entire study of narcissistic collapse. If you've gone no contact and never reached back out, not after the testing messages, not after the manufactured emergencies, not after the nostalgic 3 a.m. text that almost worked its way back into you, you've given this person something they may never have received from anyone else in their entire life, an ending they don't control the terms of. And understanding exactly what that does to them, psychologically stage by stage, is worth walking through slowly because it explains behavior that otherwise looks contradictory, erratic, and impossible to make sense of from the outside. Let's start with what silence actually represents to a narcissist structurally, because it's almost never what people assume. Most people imagine a narcissist experiencing silence the way anyone would experience losing someone they loved, grief, sadness, longing for the specific person who's gone. That's not quite accurate, and understanding why matters enormously for your own peace. A narcissist's psychological architecture, as we've discussed before, is built on an external, other-dependent sense of self, meaning their sense of who they are isn't generated internally and doesn't hold steady on its own. It requires ongoing input from outside sources to stay coherent at all. Silence, to this kind of psychological structure, isn't experienced primarily as the loss of a person. It's experienced as the loss of a function, the removal of a source that was actively, continuously confirming that they exist, that they matter, that they still have the power to affect someone deeply. This distinction changes everything about how you should interpret what happens next, because it means the silence isn't hurting them the way heartbreak hurts you. It's destabilizing them the way a missing support beam destabilizes a structure that was never actually standing on its own. And the specific nature of that destabilization unfolds in a fairly predictable sequence, one that psychologists who study narcissistic personality patterns have mapped with remarkable consistency across different individuals and different relationships. The first thing that happens, usually within the first days or weeks, is something close to disbelief, not conscious disbelief in the sense of actively doubting that you've gone quiet, but a kind of structural disbelief built into the defense mechanisms themselves. Denial in this context isn't a choice, it's automatic. The same way your hand pulls back from something hot before your conscious mind has fully registered the pain. A narcissist's psychology is specifically built to prevent full awareness of loss until absolutely necessary, because full awareness threatens the entire structure holding their sense of self together, so the initial silence gets processed internally as temporary, a pause, a predictable phase that's happened before and always, eventually, resolved itself the same way, with you reaching back out first, unable to sustain the distance any longer than they could. This is why the early testing messages arrive the way they do. Low effort, almost bored in tone, a hey or a like on an old photo, something requiring minimal investment, because minimal investment is all the situation seems to warrant at this stage. They're not expressions of longing, they're diagnostic tools, checking whether this silence is the genuine article or, like every other silence in this person's relational history, a bluff that time and a small nudge will eventually resolve. Here's what happens when that diagnostic returns nothing, a shift, subtle but significant, from disbelief into something closer to active problem solving. This is the phase where the narcissist's psychology starts treating your silence not as a temporary lull, but as an actual obstacle requiring a strategy. And because their entire relational history has taught them that pressure, applied correctly, eventually produces results, the strategy almost always involves escalation. More elaborate attempts at contact, manufactured urgency, appeals to nostalgia, timed with specific precision, sometimes messages routed through mutual friends when direct contact continues to fail. This isn't random behavior. It's a mind running through its entire established toolkit, one tool at a time, searching for the one that's always worked before and increasingly, disturbingly, discovering that none of them are working this time. This is the moment worth understanding most carefully, because it's the hinge the entire rest of this story turns on. What happens inside a narcissist's mind when the toolkit that has never failed before finally, definitively fails. Because up until this point in their life, silence from someone significant has always had a predictable resolution. Someone eventually broke first. There was always a mutual friend group keeping the door slightly open, an ex who reached out eventually because the distance became unbearable for them before it became unbearable for the narcissist. Some mechanism that meant total, permanent silence was never actually something they had to survive experiencing all the way through. What you're doing by staying silent past the point every previous version of this pattern would have resolved itself is introducing them to something genuinely, structurally new, indefinite silence with no built-in resolution, no mechanism ensuring it will eventually break in their favor the way it always has before. And a mind that has never had to sit inside that specific kind of uncertainty doesn't do it gracefully. What follows this failure of the toolkit is where the psychology gets genuinely interesting, because it diverges from what most people assume happens next. The instinct is to imagine escalation continuing indefinitely, louder, more desperate, more elaborate attempts at contact, as though enough pressure eventually has to work. Sometimes that does happen for a while. But there's a psychological limit to how long a person can sustain active pursuit of someone who never responds at all, because pursuit, even manipulative pursuit, still requires the pursuer to believe at some level that the effort might eventually pay off. Total, unbroken silence, not coldness, not anger, not engagement of any kind, just absence, starts to erode that belief in a way that partial engagement never would have. This is where a genuinely important psychological shift occurs, one that researchers studying narcissistic injury describe as the transition from active pursuit into what's sometimes called narcissistic mortification, a state distinct from ordinary embarrassment or disappointment characterized by a much deeper threat to the entire self-concept. Mortification occurs when a narcissist can no longer avoid registering at some level of awareness that the story they've been telling themselves about their own significance has been directly, undeniably contradicted by reality. Your silence, sustained long enough, becomes exactly this kind of contradiction. It says, without a single word needing to be spoken, you are not as central to this person's life as you believed yourself to be. You are not, in fact, irreplaceable, unforgettable, impossible to walk away from permanently. Someone did it, and they're still doing it, week after week, month after month, with no sign of wavering. This realization doesn't arrive as a single clean moment of insight. It arrives in fragments, ambushing the narcissist at unpredictable times in exactly the way most psychological defenses fail. Not through direct confrontation, which can be resisted, but through accumulation, through small moments that keep landing until the weight becomes impossible to fully deflect. It shows up in a new relationship, when a partner doesn't respond to a familiar pattern the way the narcissist expects, and some part of their mind can't help but compare the two situations. It shows up in an ordinary, quiet afternoon with nothing to distract from a persistent, low-grade unease they can't quite name. It shows up specifically in moments where they reach, almost reflexively, for the reassurance your attention used to provide, and find, again, that the reaching produces nothing. Here's what's genuinely important to understand about this stage because it explains behavior that otherwise seems contradictory. This is often when the story about you shifts, sometimes dramatically and almost always in a direction that has nothing to do with anything you've actually done. Because mortification is intolerable to sit inside directly, the psyche reaches for relief, and the most available relief is usually a rewritten narrative, one where your silence isn't evidence of your strength, clarity, or genuine healing, but evidence of something wrong with you instead. You become, in this revised internal story, cold, damaged, incapable of real intimacy. Someone who was always like this, which conveniently allows the narcissist to reframe your absence not as a loss they caused, but as confirmation of a flaw they claim to have identified all along. This reframing serves an important defensive function, and understanding it clearly protects you from a very specific kind of pain, the pain of hearing, sometimes through mutual connections, that your silence is being described in ways that feel like a total inversion of what actually happened. If the story is that you're cold, unstable, incapable of real connection, then your silence stops being a direct threat to the narcissist's self-concept and becomes instead simply more evidence supporting a narrative they were always going to need, eventually anyway. This is why silence often produces more elaborate story rewriting than an active breakup ever did, because active breakups usually come with at least some visible reaction from you to interpret and respond to. Silence gives them nothing to work with except their own internal narrative, which means that narrative has to do significantly more work to protect them from the mortification your absence represents. But here's the piece that makes this entire process genuinely different from every previous rupture in a narcissist's relational history, and it's the reason sustained silence produces outcomes that shorter silences never could. Stories require an audience willing to believe them, and the audience closest to a narcissist, friends, family, sometimes even the new partner who eventually enters the picture, increasingly doesn't. Because your continued absence isn't accompanied by the visible instability the revised narrative predicts. You're not falling apart publicly. You're not reaching out in crisis. You're not confirming through any observable behavior the story being told about you in your absence. Instead, whatever people in your life are witnessing, mutual friends, family members who stayed close to you, anyone with genuine visibility into how you're actually doing, tends to show something that increasingly contradicts the narrative rather than supporting it. Someone calm, stable, quietly thriving, entirely unbothered by a silence that was supposed to be devastating you. This is where the mortification, already difficult to fully deflect, becomes genuinely inescapable, because now there are two competing pieces of evidence circulating in the narcissist's world: their own internal story about your instability and the visible accumulating reality of your actual well-being, observed by people whose accounts the narcissist can't fully control or dismiss. When those two things diverge clearly enough for long enough, even a psyche built specifically to avoid this kind of reckoning starts to lose its ability to keep believing its own defense. This is the moment the psychology finally quietly resolves into something neither party gets to fully witness together, because it happens entirely inside the narcissist, with no audience, no confrontation, no dramatic scene to mark its arrival. What settles in once the story stops holding and the mortification can no longer be fully deflected isn't insight in the way you might hope for. It's rarely a clean, redemptive realization that produces genuine remorse and lasting change. What settles in for most narcissists who reach this point is something closer to a permanent low-grade recalibration, a quiet, private acknowledgement never spoken aloud, that this particular silence was different, that this particular person actually meant what she said, and that the tools which have worked on everyone else in their life simply do not work here. This recalibration matters enormously, even though it rarely produces the outcome an empath secretly hopes for when she imagines this moment. It doesn't usually turn into a message of genuine accountability, arriving finally, sincerely, with nothing attached to it except honest acknowledgement of harm caused. Some narcissists, a genuine minority, do eventually reach something like that, usually only after years and often only with real therapeutic intervention. Most don't. What most reach instead is simply a permanent internal marker. This person is different, this person is gone, this specific door doesn't reopen no matter what's tried against it, which then gets filed away without further examination, so that energy can redirect toward wherever a new, more responsive source of validation might still be available. Here's what's worth understanding clearly about what this means for you, because it's the part of this psychology that actually matters for your own life going forward, far more than the mechanics of what happens inside someone else's mind. The narcissist reaching this recalibration was never actually the goal of your silence, even though understanding that it happens can be genuinely validating after everything you went through to build it. Your silence wasn't a strategy engineered to produce a particular reaction in them. It was the natural structural result of finally, fully choosing your own peace over their access to you. And the psychological process we've just walked through happens as a byproduct of that choice, not as its purpose. This distinction protects you from a trap that catches a lot of empaths in the aftermath of going no contact. The temptation to keep checking, watching, wondering whether the recalibration has happened yet, whether your silence has finally produced the internal reckoning you might, understandably, want them to experience after everything. You don't need confirmation that it's happening in order for your own peace to be complete. It very likely is happening, roughly according to the sequence we've described, whether or not you ever get direct evidence of it. But your life, your stability, your right to simply move forward without waiting for that confirmation doesn't depend on ever finding out for certain. If you're the one holding this silence right now, resisting the pull of the testing messages, watching the story about you shift into something unrecognizable through mutual connections, wondering whether any of it is actually landing on the other side, understand that what you're doing is genuinely unprecedented in this person's relational history, and that unprecedented quality is exactly why it works the way nothing else ever has. You are not failing to get through to them. You are, for the first time in their adult life, showing them something their psychology has never had to survive processing. An ending that isn't temporary, isn't authored by them, and doesn't resolve on their terms no matter how long they wait for it to. That silence was never a message you were sending them. It was simply the sound of you, finally, no longer available to be reached. Thanks for watching.